Welcome back to the channel. This week's episode we'll be replacing a Tesla Model Y front drive motor. The underside of this vehicle was damaged from driving over an object at high speeds while on the highway. Make sure to hit that subscribe button in the upper right corner so you don't miss new episodes posted every Friday. We will start by removing the axle nuts, the speed sensors with the wiring, and the tie rods from both front knuckles. Both front sway bar links are now separated from the front sway bar. The fasteners attaching the lower control arms to the front cradle are now removed. The coolant hoses connecting the front drive motor to the high voltage battery are disconnected and plugged. The front wiring from the steering rack and drive motor is disconnected from the front main harness. Both front axles are separated from the suspension, and the subframe lift is positioned under the vehicle. With the subframe lifting tool in the correct position, the safety straps are installed around the front cradle. We are now ready to remove the bolts holding the front drive motor and front cradle to the body. The subframe lifting tool is lowered and the vehicle is raised on the hoist. The front cradle and drive motor is now ready to be rolled out of the way. The steering rack is now unbolted and removed from the front cradle. Both axles are now separated from the front drive motor. The front wiring harness is now removed from the front cradle and drive motor, along with the sway bar and horn. The lifting tool is now attached to the front drive motor. The last bolt holding the drive motor to the cradle is removed, and the drive motor is lifted away from the cradle. The new drive motor is now ready for installing to the new front cradle. The bolt attaching the drive motor to the cradle is installed and torqued to spec. Both axles are now installed into the new drive motor, along with the wiring harness. The front sway bar and steering rack are both reinstalled, and all bolts are torqued to spec and marked with a paint pen. The cradle and drive motor is now ready to be reinstalled on the vehicle. Once lined up into position, the motor mount bolts are torqued to spec and marked with a paint pen. The bolts attaching the cradle to the vehicle body are now all tightened to spec and marked with a paint pen. With the cradle reinstalled, the safety straps are now taken off and the lifting tool is removed from under the vehicle. All the bolts for the right front suspension are now installed. These fasteners will all be torqued at a later step. We will start by reinstalling the axle shaft to the knuckle, both lower control arms are reattached to the cradle, and the tie rod is connected back to the knuckle. The same procedure is now performed on the left front suspension. all the wiring is now being reconnected. Both coolant hoses to the drive motor from the high voltage battery are reinstalled. The sway bar links are now torqued to spec and marked with a paint pen. All of the lower control arm bolts on both sides are now torqued to spec and marked with a paint pen. The speed sensors are now installed back on the knuckle, and both tie rods are torqued to spec and marked with a paint pen. The steering shaft is now installed back onto the steering rack. The radiator assembly is now installed, followed by the rad support. The front rebar and absorber cushion are installed, and all airbag sensors are plugged back in. The right headlight, fender liner, and wheel are now installed. The lug nuts and axle nut will be torqued to spec in a later step. The left fender is now installed back on the vehicle. The panel will be adjusted to fit the door and hood. The left headlight, fender liner, and wheel are now installed. The lug nuts and axle nut will be torqued to spec in a later step. The front bumper is now installed back on the vehicle and the upper bolts are tightened. The right side bumper fasteners are installed, followed by the fender flare and mud flap. The left side bumper fasteners are installed, followed by the fender flare and mud flap. The lower shield is now reattached, followed by the frunk. The axle nut and all lug nuts are torqued to spec, and the covers are reinstalled. This vehicle is now finished. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new videos posted every Friday.